welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There's more information on the website womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our declaration on women's sex-based rights, which has been signed by 33,404 people from 160 countries and is supported by 465 organisations. We have over 100 volunteer activists, including 53 country contacts engaged in defending women's rights. Today, I'm really pleased to say we have Beatrice from India, who is going to be talking about the EU's evolving legal and policy approaches to gender equality, the EU being the European Union. Then we're going to hear from Amy Sousa, known Heretic, and Kay Yang, the Deprogrammer, both from the USA. They're going to do a report about the Let Women Speak USA tour, which has just finished. And Vicky Lax will be the final speaker from UK, talking about Primark Don't Go Alone, a global campaign. The first speaker I'm really pleased to introduce is Catherine from Canada. She is going to talk about the similar tactics used to promote trans and euthanasia, language that obscures and promotes, smearing opposition, people as body parts, lack of ethics, promotion through health, harm revealed due to legislation, and about women and vulnerable people being in danger. So thank you so much, Catherine, and over to you. We're going to hear from from Beatrice, who is from India. Her work, and she's going to talk about the EU's evolving legal and policy approaches to gender equality, a report on a new report from the European Institute for Gender Equality. Beatrice is a legal professional. It's a legal professional who specialised in international human rights law, violence against women and criminal law. She also currently serves as coordinator of the Legal Committee for Women's Declaration International. So thank you so much, Beatrice, for talking about this. I've been really looking forward to hearing what's going on, I suppose with trepidation, because I imagine it's going to be horrific, but over to you.
I'm going to be talking about the European Institute for Gender Equality. It is going to be a little bit of bad news because they are a completely captured institution, but we do have some reason for hope. So this is a fairly new report. It just came out a couple of months ago. The EIGE, the European Institute for Gender Equality, it isn't actually one of the bodies of the European Union. So it's important to remember that they're a think tank. They're situated in Lithuania, not in Brussels. But they do have a certain amount of influence in terms of setting the EU agenda. So they've been established to strengthen gender equality across the EU. They claim to be a European knowledge center on gender equality issues. The funny thing is, if you go to their website and if you look up sexism, they are able to say that, yes, sexism is about hatred against women and treating them as inferior and discriminating against them. But of course, at this point, they're a highly captured institution and their publications reflect that. So in this report, which came out a little while ago, they use all of the normal tricks. They talk about intersectionality. They talk about how, in order to really bring about equality between men and women, we have to use everything at our disposal, that it is far more complex, and says that the current legal framework is not sufficiently intersectional. Here's the funny thing. They cite Article 19 of the TFEU, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and claim that existing legislation does not, in fact, comply with Article 19 of the TFEU. This is a little interesting because Article 19 of the TFEU does not have the word gender in it. So it's very this is exactly where they try to reach, because how many people are actually going to try and look up what exactly the Article 19 originally said and what it's been interpreted as? So because they say it is not compliant with Article 19, but then they also go on to claim that Article 19 is insufficient because it does not use the word gender, it uses the word sex. Now, as far as the European Union is concerned, Article 19 is important because it's in this main treaty. It's in the TFEU, which pretty much determines what kind of directives, what kind of regulations come out of the European Union. And because this does not mention gender, this poses a problem for them. They also then go on to call to swiftly deblock negotiations on the proposed Horizontal Equality Directive. The Horizontal Equality Directive is a proposal that does include the word gender, and it includes a lot of the other loose language that we're sort of used to seeing now as being used to push gender ideology. They consistently push the boundaries of EU law. Now, like I said, there are a few good things, is that most of hard EU law does not actually use the word gender. There is the directive on equal treatment in occupations, and there's a directive on equal treatment in terms of benefits, and both of those use the word sex. This, again, does not really help them. So they cite the EU LGBT survey to claim that gender is now, sex is now understood in a more wide sense. And they also say, well, there is a shift. They say they acknowledge that there has been an expansion from the time that the original articles on equality in EU law were drafted. And their claim for this source is, of course, one of the documents is the EU LGBT survey. Now, as we know, a lot of the EU countries have come up with self-ID laws, kind of recognition laws, which are very much not in favor of women, but they don't have that much of substantive support in hard and the most high-ranking EU law, so to speak, because the directives really kind of rule in terms of the EU superstructure. However, there is something called the Victims' Rights Directive, which was passed in 2021. That uses the word gender-based violence and is defined as violence that is directed against a person because of that person's gender, gender identity, or gender expression, or that affects persons of a particular gender disproportionately. You can kind of see how very confused they are because they use all four of these concepts separately. Gender, GI as separate, gender expression as separate, and apparently there's another category of gender, which just makes no sense. You cannot have four different concepts lined up like this in anti-discrimination law. It simply collapses under incoherence. They claim that Council of Europe experts pushed the expansion in the gender equality concept. That is to a certain extent true. There have definitely been writers, commissioners, EU politicians who have pushed it. And predictably, they quote the latest report of the UN Special Rapporteur on, not Special Rapporteur, independent expert who does not have the same status as a Special Rapporteur on sexual orientation and gender identity. And they quote this other nonsensical line that's on my slides, which is broadly relating to how gendered societies and related constructs and expectations can influence personal identities and in social interactions. Now, this is a great line as a form of speech, but from a legal perspective, this makes no sense because this is not precise. It is not limited in any way. And Madrigal Bolos he feels quite confident pushing this. And of course, we have been trying to respond to this on that level as well. They basically argue that the shift has occurred. The interesting thing is that they do acknowledge the existence of opposition in this report. They do say there has been an increase in so-called anti-gender movements, but they argue that there has been this expansive shift in the concept of gender equality, that it now accounts for manifestations of discrimination on the grounds of gender identity and gender expression, and they argue that this has happened quite organically. What I did find interesting is that they primarily cite case law from the Court of Justice of the European Union, and that in turn quotes the European Court of Human Rights. I think most listeners here by now will be familiar with the infamous case of Goodwin from the European Court of Human Rights, which really sort of paved the way for the Gender Recognition Act in the UK itself. So this involved a case of a man who underwent surgery, claimed to be a woman, and he was in a relationship with a man and couldn't marry because he couldn't change his birth certificate. So under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, on the right to family life, he filed a case in the ECHR and won. And the ECHR said that in denying legal recognition to him, they were frustrating his right to a family life. But it's interesting to see that all of this again comes back to the fact that same-sex marriage was not allowed, because if that had been the case, the necessity for this case would not have arisen. He still had his original birth certificate, and a male could not marry another male. And that's why this route was resorted to, as saying it's because I can't be recognized as a woman that I can't get married. But the core of the problem in Goodwin and in a lot of the cases that followed, which pretty much starts the mess legally in the European sphere, is because of the lack of marriage equality. It's also interesting, I'm not sure if this has been covered before, but of course, in the ECHR decision, they do highlight that because gender identity is now a recognized medical condition, and given the state of medical knowledge on this, that the court in that case said it is wrong to not give him legal recognition as a woman. And it was this case that pushed forward for gender recognition in the UK. And of course, the fact that there was treatment. So hopefully, if the provision of treatment to undergo surgery and to get rid of sex characteristics is successful, perhaps judges will reconsider. But the sad truth is, with this case and everything that followed, gender became a thing in most European countries' laws. The CJEU, however, is a bit more interesting. The report itself repeatedly cites these cases from the Court of Justice of the European Union. For those of you here who are familiar with European hierarchy, the CJEU decides on matters of EU law, and it is supreme on those issues. So in this case, again, this person was not able to get married. And because they were not able to get married, they were not able to access their partner's pensions, everything. In this case, it was actually a woman who had undergone surgery and claimed to be in a relationship with a woman, but wanted to get married. And because of the lack of legislation allowing people from the same sex to marry, and what the CJEU basically said, this is a heterosexual couple and they want to get married. And because you're not giving them kind of legal gender recognition, they're not able to get married. So what they actually said in this case, KB versus National Health Services, is that you can't have legislation that prevents a heterosexual couple from getting married. However, what institutions like the EIGE use is to say that the CJEU said that this non-recognition of legal gender is against human rights. That's not actually what the CJEU said. In fact, in this judgment, in paragraph 33, the court clearly says it is up to national courts and national laws to decide whether to recognize the gender of a person. This case turns up in a lot of EU documents. It turns up in a lot of their propaganda to state that, the CJEU has said there should be legal recognition of gender, but it's not actually what the court said. There's also another case that they repeatedly use, Richards versus Secretary of State for Work. This guy basically wanted to retire at age 60 after undergoing surgery, which was the retirement age for women and not for men. And the Secretary of State for Work said, well, no, you're actually a male, so you can only retire at 65. And so he filed a case in the CJEU. In this case, it's not very good for us, because it says that if we're trying to bring about progressive equality in terms of between men and women, then we have to include discrimination arising from gender reassignment, because this guy who had undergone surgery wanted to get his pension earlier. And this case, in fact, does state that the notion of gender equality must require a progressive implementation and uses Directive 79/7. I focused on these three cases because they are, of course, large sources of authority for reports like this. But and I did want to highlight that sometimes they twist what the case was about in order to make their own argument. But in the report itself, as usual, there are contradictions. They state in page 11 that gender is a term to describe sociocultural constructs. Congratulations on figuring out the obvious, I guess. And then they say that, but there should be legal recognition of gender. So this is kind of the main line of attack we have with the legal committee, is to, aside from pushing that gender is not really a thing, it's also about the fact that these institutions, the Independent Expert Madrigal Bolos, the European Institute for Gender Equality, they contradict themselves. They use a definition of gender that is in line with feminist theory, that it is a socio-cultural construct, and that it mainly associates with the roles assigned to men and women. And then in the very next paragraph or the next page, they go on to argue that there must be legal recognition of it. Because yes, one might argue that ethnicity, race, religion, they're all social constructs, but some definitions of gender that even, trans-friendly organizations use clearly state that it is about roles expected of and attributed to men and women. And then they turn around and argue that this should receive protection. This brings us also to the Istanbul Convention, which of course is the convention against violence against women. And that one does use a definition of gender as the socially constructed roles, behaviors that a given society considers appropriate for men and women. This is part of their general trend of contradictions. They use a definition of gender which is clearly restrictive and then say it should be included as a gender mainstreaming perspective. They use the word gender, gender identity, gender expression, all separately. They never mention a conflict between women's rights, any kind of women's rights. They simply state, they do acknowledge that there's something called an anti-gender movement. And as usual, they just claim that it is a right-wing thing and it's something that is located in a few specific countries within the EU. They're able to limit this opposition to certain countries like Poland and Hungary, which have slightly right-wing governments, and claim that the opposition is just there. They don't even they don't mention TERFs or or a certain group of radical feminists or anyone like that. So I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. They also do note, however, that the European Network of Equality Bodies does say that there is a hierarchy in terms of grounds against anti-discrimination. So, like I said, Article 19 of the TFEU and another article in the TEU, the Treaty of the European Union, both have race and sex right in the beginning. They do not have gender. And the European Network of Equality Bodies does say that there's a hierarchy in terms of grounds for anti-discrimination law. Whether we can leverage this is a different question, but the report itself acknowledges it. So just to wrap up, it's not a very good report. They do acknowledge that there has been a shift. They try to twist a couple of the judgments that aren't as favorable to them as they presented to be. And they're still very confused. I wouldn't even say they're very confused. They pretend to use gender, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics all separately, as if the first three aren't the exact same thing. But at the same time, also use the definitions of gender that are quite regressive. So, well, we'll have to see where that goes. And hopefully we can use this to also oppose the EIG's push in terms of EU law. Thank you so much.
Have you got any ideas of what we should be doing? If
the EIG were actually in Brussels, it might actually be an idea to go protest in front of them, because the thing is, it's very convenient for the EU bodies as well as the UN to pretend like we don't exist, right? It's not even about calling us TERFs and demonizing us. Their approach is to just pretend like we don't exist. And the EIGE, of course, is just a think tank. Another alternative is, well, not an alternative really, but if one of the ongoing cases in any of the European countries were to fail, and if we were to go all the way up to the ECHR, because the problem here is Goodwin. Goodwin was decided a while ago and it has done a lot of damage. But I think now the ECHR is aware that their attempt to give a guy the right to marry has now spawned a much bigger monster. If we even get one victory at the CJEU level or at the ECHR level, that will make a big difference. But until we're there, the best option is less to sort of write reports to them, because we've been doing that now for 2 years and they just ignore us, and to, I guess, take more of a confrontational approach and really just force the EU bodies to acknowledge that there are women and that this is a different kind of opposition, but also to sort of nail on their own inconsistencies. Like, you say gender is about roles and then you want legal recognition of gender. Like, make up your mind. What I do think, however, is that it's going to be very hard to roll back everything about gender. But what can also be done is to point out that using sex as to be expanded in equality of treatment is bad. But if you really want to protect gender expression or whatever, just keep it really far away from sex and use different language. Because that's where I think the courts also get tripped up. They tend to fall into this trap of thinking it has to be under sex. And in the incentive to want to fix a blatantly unequal situation, that's part of what causes this chaos.
So we're now going to go to Amy Sousa and Kay Yang, and they are going to talk about the Let Women Speak tour in the States. So Amy Sousa, also known as known Heretic, has been an active women's rights campaigner for the last 3 years. Has organised rallies in Washington, D.C. to protest Biden's executive order, has protested the NCAA championships, gender clinics in Seattle, the UN, in New York City, protested men in women's sports against Leah Thomas at the NCCA Championships in Atlanta, and most recently staged a press conference event in her hometown of Port Townsend, Washington, which received international news coverage. Amy Sousa has testified on behalf of women and girls' sex-based rights in state legislatures and school board meetings. She holds an MA in in-depth psychology and leads workshops, classes, and individual coaching, which focuses on embodied awareness. Now, Kay Yang, who is also going to be talking, also known as the Deprogrammer, is a former trans rights activist and an LGBT non-profit whistleblower, exposing World-Wide Transgender Agenda. She's a writer, filmmaker, artist, and activist whose work explores the intersections of transgenderism and the transhumanism as the backdrop of the global agenda for female erasure. Her work is uniquely informed by her past experiences as a trans rights activist and past work indoctrinating youth with gender identity ideology in New York public schools, whilst an employee at an LGBT non-profit funded by the New York State Department of Health. So it's with great excitement. I'm so pleased to welcome you both and hand over to you.
I want to say this has been an incredible tour. Of course, we're here to talk about Kelly J. Keen's tour across the United States. We have been so excited as women in the United States to be platforming Kelly J and for her to be platforming us in return. As Kelly J says in her own words, this has been an opportunity for her to lift up the voices of United States women and our activism and our organizing. This has been a Let Women Speak tour across 11 different cities, all the way over the nation. And what Kay Yang and I have been doing, first of all, we have helped organize different events alongside the way, but we have also been holding a watch party live stream event for each city that has gone on. And it was really important for us to do a watch party where women could really participate rather than just documenting what was going on. We wanted to give opportunities for all women to share in the experience, to come together, to be able to talk to one another. And we hosted special guests along the way. And at the end of each live watch party, we did have a call-in. It was incredibly important for us as a community building effort to have opportunities to feature the voices of women who, for whatever reason, could not attend for reasons of location or for reasons of money. You know, as Kay Yang says, as is in the poster behind her, this is the record of our descent. And the other thing that is so important about this entire tour of Letting Women Speak is that mainstream media does not tell our stories. And when they do tell our stories, they often get it wrong. So we need to take these opportunities to document our own stories, to use these social media platforms and big tech, which are often biased against women, but we need to take them and use them for ourselves in order to disrupt the narrative that is being told in the press about us. And I know Kay Yang has more to say about this.
My name is Kay Yang, and this is a public record of my descent. In the US, over 90% of our media is controlled by just 6 companies. So by creating our own media, I believe we can challenge corporate dominated media and tell our own stories. As women, we've been written out of history, and now we're being written out of existence altogether. We must take ownership of media creation and dissemination by empowering women to write our own history, create our own news stories, our own videos, our own reports. We cannot wait for the establishment to tell the truth, and we should not give up control of our image, our message, and our narrative to corporate news media. It's crucial that we be establishing our own networks and opportunities for media distribution, which is exactly what Amy and I tried to do with this live stream series.
I also think it's so important. Of course, we are all so excited to have had Kelly J come and bring her clout and bring her popularity and her vivacious energy that she has for these Speakers Corners events that she started in the UK. But what is also so great to see is that so many women who have in the United States who have been doing these events already got an opportunity to shine and to show the organization and the activism that they have already been doing and to put their energy of that into this tour. I really want to underscore that there was a lot of hard work being done by so many women, scouting locations, acquiring permits, liaising with the police, hiring security where needed, making posters and banners and stickers and flyers, getting different sound equipment and amplification equipment, Zoom meetings, email invites, just all kinds of organizing and activism. And it's really important to Kay Yang and I to shout out the organizers in each city because they all deserve to be lifted up and recognized for their work. In Los Angeles, we had Melissa Cohen and Gay Chapman. In San Francisco, we had Lierre Keith and Arla Heil.
In Portland, thank you to Holly Hart. In Tacoma, thank you, April Morrow. In Austin, thank you to Isabella Malbin, Michelle Evans, Mary Lou Singleton, Megan Murphy, and Trish Morrison.
In Chicago, thank you to Jeanette Cooper and Carrie Bruss and Beth Lowe. In Loudoun County, thank you to Natasha Grover and Tanya Marie.
In Miami, thank you, Kelly Kay and Alex Pinwheel Art. In DC, thank you, Kara Dansky.
In Philly, thank you, Jennifer Thomas and Connie Hahn and Jessica Gonzalez. And then, of course, thank you so much in New York City, Kay Yang and Amanda Stuhlman of Keep Prison Single Sex. It was an absolute honor to stand by your side and to organize in that city with you both. Thank you.
And thank you, Amy Sousa, for your support in New York City and all the work that you did in making this tour possible. Thank you to Jeanette and Jennifer from Partners for Ethical Care for assisting me in New York City as well. During our tour watch party live streams, we tried to draw on our different experiences. And I drew on my experience of 20 years engaged in grassroots activism and community organizing building to provide unique insights to our listeners and familiarize them with what they could expect at these types of events. I created protest preparedness guide and a conflict de-escalation guide, both available for free on stopfemalerasure.com, because I believe that planning and de-escalation is key in situations that could potentially be disrupted by male violence. So there was a lot of really meticulous planning for this whole tour. This tour created so many opportunities for us American women. It presented us with a choice, a really important choice to work together and collaborate. And this also highlighted the difficulties in organizing across our many divides. As you all around the world might know, Americans are very divided, not just over race and class, but also over political, ideological, and religious beliefs. So these differences can contribute to some difficulties in our communication. Communication is key when it comes to well-organized, effective, and safe actions. Effective communication strategy supports movement building, and lack of communication creates confusion, drains energy and resources, and fosters competition over cooperation. So by no means am I saying that we women are a monolith, but we are all connected because we are all fighting back against the colonization of our female sex. We don't want to be marching in lockstep or around like robots, like Bertie Rose says. We don't want to be making all women conform to a lowest common denominator, but we also don't want to be so discordant that we become too competitive or even oppositional to one another. I believe in a diversity of creative strategies and tactics, and different women must do different things in different places. No one woman can reach all women, and we all play our part and reach certain sectors of people in society. There's no magic one-size-fits-all template for how things must be done. So it's really important that we continue to choose to foster mutual respect and cooperation and allow women to do what works for them where they are.
There is not a one size fits all, and each city really requires its own tactics and its own strategies. And I think that that was really obvious throughout the tour. I want to talk a little bit about the tactics that we saw in the opposition. There were different tactics used in different cities, the West Coast being very different than the East Coast. We saw in the West Coast, there were a lot of challenges with getting police to be on the ground. We had in Tacoma 23 police calls during the event, many police liaison conversations before the event. The police did not show up until long after the event. So that was, for example, very different than what we saw in New York, where there was a strong police force, or in Chicago with their noise tactics. We saw the tactics of the opposition in Tacoma and the Olympia event that was organized by Sovereign Women Speaks that ended up being canceled. You see the opposition coming. They are self-proclaimed Antifa. They are in black bloc. They are geared up with weapons, with fortified gloves that are like knuckle guards. They are coming prepared for the fight. You can see it. They have earpieces in. They are in constant communication. There are those in the back who are organizing and directing those in the front. So these tactical maneuvers are really important to witness. We see that their tactics on the ground are similar to their ideological tactics. Their tactics are to be the aggressors. Their tactics are to violate our line, violate our boundaries. We see this again and again. I want to talk about the importance of entrusting our instincts. I'm often talking about embodiment. There was a moment in Tacoma where Lear Keith was being aggressed from behind. She very likely would have been tackled. In that moment, I think many of you saw the video of this, but what I want to observe is that I responded with not with a thinking, what should I do, what should I not do in this, prefrontal cortex area. I responded as an instinct to protect. Amy Ichikawa in LA had a moment of sharing a speech about from an incarcerated woman named Celine. Amy Ichikawa, of course, is the leader of Women to Women. Herself, she is a formerly incarcerated woman doing activism on their behalf. But Selena's story is really important to highlight because she spoke about being groomed. She was violated and groomed since the age of 2. The adults that she trusted raped her, abused her, trafficked her. She was incarcerated at 17 for fighting against her attacker. And the pivotal moment, she learned because of that not to trust her body, that her body was not her own. And the pivotal moment for her was in incarceration, where she heard another woman during a strip search say the word no. This changed her. Hearing another woman have boundaries and stand up changed her perspective. She started being an activist on the inside, fighting for incarcerated women from the inside. So this is pivotal to remember and understand that we're facing a movement of boundary violation, and us standing up for our boundaries is in fact part of our activism.
I want to switch and talk quickly about what happened in New York City, because that's the event that all eyes were on. That is the event where Kelly J was kept out of her own event. So I've organized several actions specific to this issue in New York City before, including at sex role control centers, aka gender clinics, and also at the United Nations headquarters, which helped to give me insight into how to coordinate this event, because New York City is entirely unlike any other city that was on the tour. We are talking about the home of the Stonewall riots. This city is really just a whole other beast, and organizing within it requires a certain kind of know-how to deal with it all. This was reflected in our strategic choice of location at the New York City Hall, which contains the office of the mayor and is next door to the New York State Department of Education. We knew that another location would most likely not have received the amount of police presence and support that proved absolutely necessary to hold back the violent mob of hundreds. I want to thank my friend and colleague Amanda Stuhlman, the USA Director of Keep Prisons Single Sex, for her meticulous work, jumping through hoops on short notice to defeat New York City bureaucracy and ensure that we got the proper permits for our event. She also negotiated with police at the First Precinct and City Hall ahead of the event. I contracted 5 private security guards to protect our women, especially to keep an eye on our high-profile attendees. Both Amanda and myself liaised with the police on the day of. Our safety precautions turned out to be right on target. Many women reported being pushed and shoved, including Jennifer Lahl, the producer of the Detransition Diaries and president of the Center for Bioethics. Several women of color were physically abused, including myself. A Black woman was called a black bitch and the N-word while being pushed and shoved. Another Black woman was prevented from getting inside the barricade as trans rights activists pushed us and ripped her and myself apart. And remember, we were the ones who were being screamed at, called racist and white supremacists. My hair and head was pulled by a transgender identified man. That was just one of the times that the barricades were breached. Gina Hoke was spit on 3 times by another trans-identified man, the same man who hit me while I was giving my speech. He also hit a cop and called Stonewall Riot veteran Jim Forat a, quote, fucking faggot. At one time, our group of about 24 women and a few male allies were pushed with our backs completely up against the fence. Our security team was lined up in front of us. The police were lined up in front of them, the barricades in the middle, and then hundreds of trans rights activists and so-called anti-fascists, they're the fascists, hundreds of them charged at the barricade, lifting it up into the air, and you can see them on video striking the cops as they did this. They were so full of hatred and a desire to hurt and punish women that they were willing to fight a wall of NYPD on camera, by the way, just to get a chance to get their hands on us. Prior to the event, flyers were circulating online with instructions to shut down our permitted exercise of free speech. One flyer had a drawing depicting 2 groups on a New York City street. On one side, there was a massive, never-ending mob of people that fades into the background. They were holding transgender flags, rainbows, and traditional black and white and red Antifa flags. The other side shows us distinctly female drawings of women laying on the ground, holding their heads on their knees, cowering in fear. One woman is depicted with a bullhorn with a sign that reads, "I had this coming. I had this coming." Not only did they publicly express their intent to hurt women, but they fervently incited violence against us online through their networks and social media. We were depicted as having been to blame for the male violence that was to be committed against us, to have been asking for it, for daring to show up publicly and defend women and girls. So I want to talk briefly about violence. What is it and what it is not? Violence against women is integral to the process of colonization and imperialism. We are fighting against the colonization of the female sex and our biology. The context we live in is one of male dominance and female subordination, skyrocketing rates of sex-based violence and femicide all around the world. We must make a distinction between violence and self-defense. Confusion surrounding these differences caused a lot of tensions in the US and came up repeatedly in the live stream chats throughout the tour as women in cities across America were put for the first time into positions, many of them, for the first time into positions where they were faced with violence and had to act quickly to protect themselves and others. Women who defend themselves against violence committed by male predators are not engaged in violence. Self-defense is not violence. If we frame self-defense as violence, it neutralizes and ignores the power imbalances inherent within the patriarchal order. Framing self-defense as violence contributes to criminalization of women who refuse to suffer violence patiently and wait for predators and oppressors to stop hurting us. It also isolates women who choose to engage in self-defense from community support. Equating women's self-defense with male violence creates ambiguity about who is the victim and who is the offender. The violence that occurred in New York City was completely one-sided. There was one group committing violence against the other. Our group showed up with the intent of a peaceful demonstration and remained peaceful despite engaging in minor instances of self-defense to ward off attackers. Now, this is important because in contrast to what really happened at New York City Hall, the media portrayed our group as anti-gay rights protesters. They said that we clashed with LGBTQ supporters. They completely neutralized the violence that occurred against us and depicted it as having come from both sides. In doing this, they labeled us far-right turf demonstrators. One article also described us by saying, quote, protesters stood their ground and refused to vacate the area, leading to further brawls. Again, this victim blaming narrative that, and I just need to say that male violence is never the fault of women or women's responsibility.
We can see that they are trying to twist that narrative and tell a story against us. And we have to remember that we are facing an ideology whose values are all about dissociation. They are all about cognitive dissonance. They are all about boundary violation. We hear it. You could hear it in the protesters, especially in New York City. They were using all kinds of tactics of this against us. They were not only using violent tactics, but their words, calling us ugly, calling us fat, calling us bad eyebrows, bad hair, fat, old. They kept saying old, that no men want us. So this is absolutely an ideology of objectification and dissociation from their body. What they were spewing at us, when they spew at us, when they use these tactics against us, they are indeed telling on themselves. They are telling about themselves. They are exposing their own value system to us. So this is why it is so important to remember that embodiment, what I think is the medicine to this ideology that instills the listening to one's sense perceptions, listening to one's instincts, listening to one's intuition. This is the antithesis and the medicine to the valuation of ourselves as disembodied objects. So embodiment is also, it's not a new age concept. It is practical, and it is incredibly important to our activism. We need to ground ourselves in this. Gavin de Becker, in his book, The Gift of Fear, speaks about how important it is to be attuned to one's environment and the moment as a safeguarding imperative. Safeguarding necessitates being in tune and being in a responsiveness, having responsibility to one's own safety requires listening. Now, this is not living in a constant state of anxiety. It is being calm, present, embodied to what is happening in the moment. These are incredibly volatile situations. And I know that so many of us come because of come to this because we are triggered here. A lot of us are, like myself, are survivors. And I do want to say to women out there, you must be really mindful what events you choose to go to. If you are currently living in a triggered state of being, I don't think it is right for every woman to choose the most volatile places to go. There are other cities that are not as volatile. And if you are in a triggered state, you cannot be responsive or attuned to your own instincts, because This is, I think, our responsibility that we have. Our message is to combat the values that we are seeing in the opposition, and our responsibility on the ground to one another is to be present to our instincts and intuition. That is what keeps one another safe on the ground.
The gender identity industry has spread its tentacles into every facet of society. This is being perpetrated on a local, regional, state, and federal level under the direction of global governing bodies like the United Nations, who interpret the term gender to include gender identity, meaning initiatives originally presented to further rights for females worldwide are now being directed towards the promotion of policies that undermine needs, rights, and safety of women and girls. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, aka Agenda 2030, is an open plan to force gender identity ideology on the people of the world at the expense of the female sex class, starting with the most vulnerable women and girls in society and utilizing existing global corporate power structures in partnership with the governments of 193 member nation states. This highly coordinated effort requires the collusion of big banks, big pharma, mainstream media, academia, state, corporate, private, and nonprofit sectors to all work in concert toward the goal of total colonization of the female reproductive system and female biology. We as women must unify against our highest enemies, just as they have unified against us in their attempts to colonize and control our bodies and life on Earth. Women of the world united cannot be defeated.
The diversity of tactics and strategy is not just a diversity of tactics and strategy for on the ground, but in general, we need to be, this is a juggernaut. This is a $5.2 trillion industry that we are facing off against, backed by big tech, big pharma, big banks, corporations, Hollywood, all of that. So we have to come at it with a diversity of tactics ourselves. We need people to write books and write articles. We need people to hold Zoom meetings and conversations. We need people to do boots on the ground events. There's really something for everyone here. And, one thing I mentioned earlier in the beginning, that role of the witness, the role of the witness to these live stream events, it is important. Their role in seeing and viewing and being a part of being the container that watches what's going on, that is important. The women who are amplifying and posting it on their social media, that is an important role too. So there is no real role in this movement that is unimportant, and all of it is needed. And I don't think, I hope that people give themselves credit where credit is due for what they are doing and do not beat themselves up for what they aren't doing, because all of these different roles are important.
They're coming at us with so many different heads, this big multi-headed hydra. We have to be just like that as well. And just one of us, it's like a flea on the side of a dog. If it's just one of us, it's just an annoyance, just a small nuisance. But many of us all together biting and biting and biting and biting, we can take it down, I love dogs, so I don't mean the dog, but we can take down this global agenda to colonize the female sex.
So we're going to hear for our final speaker is Vicky Lax. She is promoting and working with others on a global campaign, Primark Don't Go Alone. Vicky is an activist and a campaigner focused on protecting sex-based rights of women and girls, currently campaigning to get Primark, which is a fashion retailer, to reinstate single-sex changing rooms. So thank you so much, Vicky, and over to you.
I joined a couple of weeks ago, and things have moved on somewhat since then. And I suppose the trepidation is, I thought it was bad, and it is absolutely horrendous what I'm hearing about Primark. Some of it, I'm afraid, I'm not in a position to share. So just a little bit of a quick recap. So in 2015, Primark who are a fast fashion chain. Their main demographic is women and young women. It's a young demographic, but they are broadening out now into the menopause range and a post-breast cancer range. Don't be fooled by what you hear people saying that they are not in competition in the UK with M&S. These guys are driving the footfall in the UK to the high street. They are investing when nobody else is. So there's a lot of kind of classism that we're seeing, particularly in the UK, about Primark, but don't kind of be fooled by that. They are really in a very dominant position in terms of the changing face of the high street, particularly in the UK. Obviously, I can't speak for the other 13 geographies that they trade in. So in 2015, they allowed transgender customers to try clothes on in whichever changing room they wanted to, but there were still complaints from people who weren't happy with that. So they went fully gender neutral, in their words, in 2019. There are well-documented cases dating back to 2007 of male sexual violence taking place in their stores and in their changing rooms. Some of them, you know, certainly since I last spoke, have come to light. One that's being publicised most recently is a woman who was in a Stratford store, happily changing some clothes on, and then a group of men decide that, you know, they'll just draw the curtain back on her. Primark offered her a £10 voucher. So we are hearing, you know, there are young women posting again on TikTok. We're hearing about incidents in Doncaster. We're hearing about numbers of incidents in Sheffield, in London, in Scotland. So this is very well documented and very, very concerning. So they've gone on a little bit of a performative, we're going women only. It isn't women only. I'm really sorry, but to any woman who thinks that it's women only, when we have been told by head office and by the staff on the ground that a man who identifies as a woman is going to be allowed in, it isn't women only. I think it is fair to say, you know, I've been into a number of Primark stores, as have other women. The women there are holding the line. They know what they're managing, they know the risks, and they are working incredibly hard to protect women and girls, but it shouldn't be up to them. It shouldn't be up to shop floor staff to police and manage a reckless and a dangerous policy. So Primark are well aware of what's going on. As an aside, Primark are owned by a company called Associated British Foods, who in turn are owned by Whittington Investments Limited, who in turn are owned by majority shareholding by the Garfield Weston Trust. That trust is set up by the Weston family, who come from Canada. These people, they can't say they don't know what's going on, even if it's only me writing to them, because they do. They are just choosing to not answer. And they think that it's okay to offer women £10 when men harass them sexually in their mixed sex changing rooms. We know, you know, pretty much what I've said here. We know what's going on. They know what's going on. They are choosing to not respond. I am in communication with somebody at Primark. We will see where that goes, but I'm afraid it feels a little bit more performance than substantive, particularly when the member of staff that I talked to in her initial letter to me, she described some of these incidents as antisocial behaviour. I don't really have the words to describe what I think about that, but I'm sure you can, mainly because I don't want to have too many things cut out of what I'm saying. The other thing I would say, and we are working on this, because sometimes you start off with something and you see where it goes. There's no consistent format of stores for Primark. So what we have been told, and I guess I need to ask women to trust me on this, but I can't name the people who contact me for very obvious reasons. But we are being told in some stores They have the men's and the children's changing room on one floor and the women on the other. So we are being told by managers at Primark that female staff are being abused by men when these female staff try and stop men following children into the changing rooms.